Bom dia. Bom dia a todos. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, you who's online watching us this morning. For those of you who missed yesterday and are joining us today, I would like to update you with what we did, what we had yesterday. So in the morning, Professor Cervone talked to us about personality theories and the sociocognitive theory, and also Bandura's sociocognitive theory. In the afternoon, we had the presence of Professor Scott, who gave us a lecture on person in context assessment procedure, assess personality structures. We thank you both for your knowledgeable words. And this morning, we'll have Professor Cervone again to share with us his perspective on modeling the architecture of personality systems, the knowledge appraiser personality architecture, or Kappa Model. In afternoon, we're going to have Professor Scott again with us. And now, excuse me, Professor Cervone, I'll switch to Portuguese. Eu só gostaria de lembrá-los que o professor Scott trabalha, ele é um psicólogo clínico, não é apenas um professor universitário, mas ele dirige uma clínica na universidade onde ele trabalha. Então, ele tem importantes contribuições para a gente a respeito não só da maneira da personalidade, mas como também ser trabalhado dentro de um contexto universitário. So, Dr. Professor Cervone, please welcome.
Thank you. And it's working. Well, welcome back. My apologies if anybody didn't see the first two lectures, but soon they'll be available online somewhere. This talk completely assumes that you've seen the two lectures. So if you're just sitting there in the year 2047 watching the lecture series, go back to lecture 1, and then this one will make sense. It begins with two quotes. One, you never know whether to say it's a quote from Socrates or a quote from Plato. I don't fully understand exactly the way Plato was using Socrates. I don't imagine Plato was actually recording the Socrates lectures and transcribing them. But in any case, it's probably Plato, and it's a picture of... But it's the source of, at least in American English, and Greek too, a relatively famous quote, which is that one of the things to do analytically, and I suspect they had something in mind that resembled science and a scientific, even though it wasn't the same sense of science, scientific understanding of the social world as us, is to make sure you are talking in a way that the words you use correspond to naturally occurring variations and distinctions, so that if there's an important naturally occurring distinction, the words you're using correspond to it. And if you create a word, it doesn't mix up things that are actually distinct. And in any case, the words are supposed to carve nature according to their joints. The second quote is rather more contemporary. And it's from Donald Meichenbaum. Donald Meichenbaum, if you don't know, was one of the leaders intellectually of cognitive behavioral therapy. So something that happened after Bandura's Principles of Behavior Modification textbook is that there was then a next generation of scientists, of Walt Scotts, of clinical scientists in the 1970s, all of whom used as their textbook Bandura's Principles of Behavior Modification, and this created a quite intellectually sophisticated set of psychological theorists, scientists, clinicians, one of whom was Donald Meichenbaum, who was the person that the journal Psychological Inquiry invited to review Bandura's social foundations of thought and action, and Meichenbaum is well aware, that's Robert Barron in his APA journal, Contemporary Psychology Review, that this was quite a good book. And if you don't know all of Bandura's work, even with the new book coming out, this book of decades ago is clearly the definitive, comprehensive Bandura book. But Meichenbaum says the following. Perhaps I shouldn't say it here in a social cognitive theory series of lectures, but Meichenbaum does say this, and I have to say he's right. Or I'll let him speak for himself. Maybe I'll say he's wrong as a tribute to Bandura. But there is something that's not done in Social Foundations of Thought and Action. And Meichenbaum quite reasonably writes that it's with regard to cognitive structures or schemata that social cognitive theory, as stated by Bandura, hadn't quite worked out the details yet. I don't know why. It's a mystery to me, even though I was there at the time. You know, my anecdote is that when I was in graduate school, I should do the anecdote in this audience, that the Social Foundations of Thought and Action was being written. I was there on the day in which the person who was doing the typing learned that it's not called social learning theory anymore. Now it's social cognitive theory. And this was before the days of find and replace commands. And so the person had to go back by hand through the manuscript and change it. But in any case, Meichenbaum points out correctly that in discussing schemata, Bandura says things that are exactly what so many people say. Well, this is literally a quote. People say this all the time. There's knowledge structures, belief, scripts, stereotypes, prototypes. What in blazes are we talking about? Are these the same thing? Do they overlap? How do these words relate to things in nature? What are the boundary conditions? Is everything a script? Or maybe only the stereotypes are scripts? How would you measure any of these things? Much of the discourse, including broadly in any cognitive approach to personality, a lot of social cognition and cognitive therapy is like this. At some point in the 70s, people introduced terminology to refer to knowledge people have. The terminology just gets all kind of jumbled around. And if we were in another field, this would be quite odd. It would be like saying, well, there's bones and the knee, and there's a skeletal structure, and all the words seem to just be the jumbled, overlapping kind of thing. So those were the opening quotes. Now we're going to start with two questions. There are so many slides that I can hardly remember what's going to occur next on the slide. I'm afraid it's another one of those emoticons. Yes, good. I'm genuinely surprised by my own talk at this point. And it's the beginning. Here's the two, so if you've gone back and watched the videos, you know that what's on screen are the two variable sets in which Bandura and Michel, semi-independently, partly by having conversations in a swimming pool at Stanford University, suggest core units of analysis. Bandura suggests these 5, Michel suggests those 5 on the right. Here's a question: which one do you prefer? Why? Why would you possibly prefer one to the other one? How would you evaluate which one you prefer? Here's another list of social cognitive personality variables. Thank you for all the hosting here in Campinas. At some point, or wherever I was on Saturday morning, when making up the slides, I just made up some new variables. Here's 5. Which ones do you prefer? Well, the standard, if there's 2 distinct features of human beings, it's the ability to mentally time travel, think about the past and future, and to use language. Frankly, if some organism went by, landed from outer space, and had no ability to communicate in language, then we wouldn't think of them as persons. But that's, for some reason, isn't one of the personal basic capabilities mentioned much at all. I mean, mine seems almost as good as theirs, and I literally just made it up sitting around in a hotel bed, which is bad, which suggests that something's not right. So, sorry, that guy goes. I spent too much time on those. Here's the other kind of question. It's completely unrelated, it seems, but by the time the talks end in 15 hours, it's supposed to not seem unrelated. So in the first empirical publication by Bandura, Adams, and Bayer on self-efficacy, This is the original publication in which Bandura had been running participant modeling studies demonstrating profoundly large and rapid changes in phobic behavior. At some point in 1975, began to ask himself, what is the mediator of these? Reran the studies with the self-efficacy measures, and I don't know which came out first, but somewhat simultaneous with the self-efficacy theory paper is the first empirical report, which must have come out first since it's referenced in the Psych Review paper. And he tells us there's different dimensions of self-efficacy judgment, one of which is generalities. For example, if you have an intervention, well, maybe the intervention will cause a broad change across multiple challenges and domains of life, or maybe it won't. This is taken up by an extremely well-done study by a student of Bandura's back in those days, Lloyd Williams and his colleagues, who were studying agoraphobics. So, of course, the agoraphobics are experiencing challenges, irrational fears, inhibited behavior in multiple domains of life. Walt could do this better. Professor Scott could do these details better than I can, but the person might be fearful going to a shopping center, fearful going to a restaurant, lots of different settings involving, it's good we had Socrates up there, the agora are fear-creating for the person. So what happened is Lloyd Williams ran this kind of intervention. There was a treatment in one domain, and the treatment is the mastery treatment developed by Bandura and others in the 1970s, in which the person goes into the situation and with the help of the therapist does something. And he does that in one of the challenges. They go to a restaurant, and then there's an assessment in the other circumstances, the transfer that may occur, the generalization that may or may not occur in self-efficacy. And here's what he finds. Well, yes, there was generalization, but it was variable and idiosyncratic. Some people had a widespread change. Some people were successful in a restaurant and only had a change in one domain. They were able to go to the shopping center. Other people had mastery treatment in the restaurant and had a change in a different domain. They were able to go to a bowling alley or whatever else human beings were doing in 1989. So, for some reason, self-efficacy beliefs were generalizing across domains, but it wasn't clear why. They actually write, major challenge now is to account for what happened in the study. There wasn't even an intellectual tool available to account for why self-efficacy judgments generalize across domains. Of course, you could say it's the principle of generalization, but that's silly. That just describes the phenomenon that needs to be explained, so it can't be that it's occurring. There are cases, for example, in Pavlovian conditioning, where you can imagine using the word generalization because you know the precise parameter you're varying. So Pavlov runs the thing by setting off a tone at a certain beep, and then he just varies the beep parametrically across wavelengths of sound. And there you know there's only one little stimulus. But in the case of agoraphobia, the situations have multiple features to them. There's lots of people around. You might feel claustrophobic. You might think the people are looking at you. You might be anticipating a particular mistake you'll make. You might be anticipating fear of your own anxiety in the situation. It's not clear at the level of the individual why the person is fearful in the first place, and therefore there's nothing to do with patterns of generalization except to say they existed. And note, sorry, I should speak more formally. This generalization question is quite similar to the seemingly unrelated question from the video or talk you attended personally yesterday, because Gordon Allport's question about personality qualities rendering many stimuli functionally equivalent, the core phenomenon, at least in the US, of personality psychology, there's some consistency or generality in behavior, is the same thing. So in Allport's language, well, there's some people, they look like that, they see different situations, and they act in a manner that's relatively consistent. In personality trait language, they have the trait of friendliness or sociability. Again, though, that's a miserable explanation of what they're doing because the behaviors are simply one's called friendly. The trait is called friendliness. It's like explaining in a medical school where we are that the person is feeling ill today because of their sickliness. That is, it's exactly like saying that. So that can't be good. But the phenomenon is kind of like the same one as this generalization. The situations are equivalent for the person. In a very handy language, the odd empirically but strong theoretically American psychologist Darrell Bem says that the issue here is that there are equivalence classes. Some groups of situations that seem different for some people seem kind of the same for somebody else. Oh, note, in that lateral language of equivalence classes, or a category of situations, now introduces something. For those of you, and I'm informed that here in Brazil, it's many of you, who don't live in a world of cognitive science of the last 40 years, categorization is one of the most highly studied topics. If you were to list 6 to 8 topics that are highly studied and it's reasonable to claim well understood, one of them within the field of cognitive science unquestionably would be categorization. The examples are probably completely unneeded, but at least it gave me an example to put some pictures, an excuse to put some pictures up on screen. So if we look at those things, we're immediately, actually without my even asking the question, we're immediately thinking that all of them, or maybe all of them, are furniture. I didn't have to say, by the way, might they be furniture? Immediately they're furniture, and without any instruction, you're already thinking, well, I wonder if a wicker waste paper basket even counts as furniture. That's the nature of categories. They have a fuzzy quality. They have a family resemblance or a prototype quality, as philosophers and then psychologists a couple decades later realized in the 20th century. A reasonable language for what you did immediately when the pictures went up on screen is you implicitly asked yourself the question. Even if you didn't do it explicitly, you pretty quickly said, oh, it's some furniture. That is, you evaluated these things or appraised them. Oh, what quality do they have? Oh, they're furniture. You could only do that, of course, if you already had in your head, so to speak, a category, some knowledge about furniture, or it's reasonable to say a furniture schema, a very general conceptual sense of what counts as furniture. If hypothetically, it's not that hypothetical, if you came from some nomadic tribe that moved from place to place and ate dinner sitting on rocks, you might not have a category of mind called furniture. You wouldn't, and therefore you wouldn't categorize these as furniture. It's obvious. Are these forms of exercise? If I introduce a concept, good exercise, I believe those meta virtual world things will be getting smaller soon. Pretty soon this will look like the old-fashioned cell phone that was the size of a shoebox. But if you ask me, I don't know, maybe playing indoor, I don't know, maybe. But you immediately evaluate them and you praise them. Well, weightlifting, yeah, sure. Running in clip art, I don't know, walking, maybe if you do a lot of the walking, and I don't know, playing golf in your house with a thing stuck on your head. But in any case, you already have some concept of exercise. It's easy to imagine a society in which people in their day-to-day life are farming and resting at home and don't have a category of activity called exercise. Obviously, you need a kind of an industrialized world to even invent the category of exercise in the first place. But the point is that it's obvious there's two kinds of things. Something happens in front of us and we evaluate it. It's reasonable to use the verb appraise it. And the appraisals are done with a kind of a tool for appraisal, which is some knowledge we already have. If we didn't have that knowledge, if we were from a society where people work all day in a field, and don't come home and go to a gymnasium, then we wouldn't have a category of action called exercise. We have that because from our social experiences, we have some pre-existing knowledge of what exercise is. It's very hard to spell it out because so many diverse things might be called exercise, but you recognize it right away. If I put up somebody playing checkers or chess, you would not have said it's exercise. You still would have said you might have said it's a game, so you would apply another category, but not exercise. All of this is obvious. And the use, going back all the way back to the philosopher Kant, the concept of a schema, you might not be able to spell it out in words, but you've got the knowledge and you apply it, is a useful term for, as Walt already said in the previous talks, for talking about the knowledge that you have to appraise events. Note, that's the distinction between knowledge and appraisal. It's totally straightforward, pretty obvious once you spell it out. We constantly evaluate things. If you imagine us being in a different culture without the categories of an industrialized Western world culture, well then we wouldn't make the same evaluations, but we'd make some different evaluations. You can easily imagine a world in which things are evaluated by everyone as being holy or not, in a world that was more dominated by spiritual thought than the contemporary industrial world, and on and on and on, depending on the cultural setting. You could also imagine individual differences, so that if somebody is a gymnasium trainer, then they might have a slightly different conception of exercise than you, and they would have only counted the first two, the running and the weightlifting, as exercise, because there may be individual differences in the knowledge structure. So that's the language that, of course, is going to go into the rest of the presentation. The language I use in the Kappa model of knowledge and appraisal is not a particularly odd, specialized thing. It's completely self-evident. Anybody who thinks about thinking processes would imagine that people have some sort of pre-existing mental frameworks that they use to make sense of the world. A useful language, they assign meaning to events. It's a slightly awkward but still useful language. Oh yes, this is a meaningful event. It's not just people gathering. They are honoring me because I passed some, my apologies for not remembering that, some exam like Roberto recently, and I get advanced to something. It's not just a random gathering, it's a meaningful experience. The meaning comes from the fact that you have some existing knowledge of your culture and your own experiences, and you blend them together, and that's what creates the meaning. This process of thinking about the world, of course, is exactly what social cognitive theory is about. This is sort of the whole point. The idea of having a social cognitive theory is that you can understand people and their capacity for agency and psychological change by looking at mental events or cognition that develop and function in social settings or are social cognition. This means that a minimum first step, if you wanted to do what Socrates/Plato wanted to do on slide 1, or perhaps if you wanted to do what Donald Meichenbaum said was not done on slides 2 and 3, a minimal necessary distinction is to distinguish between knowledge structures. They're sort of in your head, you've got them. If you fall asleep, you've still got them. If the person is asleep, it's reasonable to say that they still know what exercise is and furniture is, for example. That's a necessary joint to carve. And so here's the oddity of the social cognitive personality variables. I don't quite understand how it happened, but neither of the quite wonderful foundational figures of the 20th century said that explicitly. Of course they knew that. That's what Meichenbaum was saying. But they didn't say that explicitly, and if you don't say that explicitly, the great risk is that you're going to use everyday terms in the dictionary of English or whatever particular dictionary you prefer, everyday terms as if they're scientific terms, but the term may not have carved nature at its joints, creating a somewhat confusing literature. For example, consider Michel's expectancy variables. Well, there are some things I expect. I expect that the sun will always rise in the east. I also expect that this slide will be off screen within 45 seconds. For years and years, I have expected that the sun will rise in the east, and will continue to do so. I've never thought that the slide will disappear within 45 seconds until right now when I remembered that that's what the text would be on screen, and I'm likely to forget this by tomorrow. Those are both expectancies, but it hardly makes sense if you're trying to model human cognition to use one word to refer to a stable piece of information that you will always believe and something you're going to forget in, oh, I better get the slide off the screen or it'll be wrong. So the expectancies is obviously insufficient as a scientific term because there's a distinction between knowledge and appraisal that's not captured by the term. I hate to say it here. Let's forget this part of the talk. Here's a study on self-efficacy. People are asked, what performance level can you achieve in the next 5 minutes? So self-efficacy refers to a dynamic appraisal. There's no expectation that the person will make the same appraisal 5 minutes later. In fact, that's the point of the study. The point of the study is once the person gets feedback, they might have an entirely new appraisal. In this study, self-efficacy is sort of analogous to, is that furniture? The question, the evaluation of the thing, but the thing in this case is oneself. It's a projecting yourself in the future. Oh, I wonder how I'll do in the next 5 minutes. Here's another study. People are asked, how well can you resist peer pressure to use drugs? And self-efficacy, as measured that way, is used in a longitudinal study that lasts 2 years. That means the conception here is that self-efficacy refers to a belief that people are likely to have in a consistent manner for years. Otherwise, it makes no sense to have run the longitudinal study in the first place. That's funny, because that means the term in one scientific paper is being used to refer to an ongoing appraisal process that will change every couple of minutes, and in another paper is being used to refer to a belief that is anticipated to be unchanged over a span of years. In one case, it's an evaluation right now of an activity that's about to happen, and in the other case, it's a general class of activities that you'll experience repeatedly over years of time. I know it's not going to change, but for some reason we use the same term for that, which is rather like using the term expectancies to refer to sun rising in the east and slide being off the screen in 45 seconds, and not entirely unlike using the same term to refer to knowledge we have about furniture and evaluating whether a waste paper basket is furniture, all of which are plainly different activities. So, he's back, sorry. The idea here is that it would be nice, there are taxonomies that clearly cut nature at its joints. Things like nervous system, muscular system, skeletal system, it's literally at the joints. I forgot where the term came. Yes, skeletal system. They work, but everyday terms like goals, expectancies, intentions obviously seem not precise enough. Some additional distinction is needed. Otherwise, you will use, goal is to go on to the next slide in a few seconds. Goal is to, save enough money for retirement. I mean, they're both goals in the natural language of English folk psychology, but it might not be the case that the everyday language of folk psychology is sufficient scientifically. It usually isn't. Before I move on, note, everything I said is pretty obvious to lots of other people. No cognitive psychologist. If a cognitive psychologist says I'm studying memory, it's probably unlikely, I'm running a study now on memory. It's pretty unlikely they're studying memory in general. Memory in general hardly makes sense. They're at the barest conceivable minimum, they would make some distinction between information you're remembering that occurred 20 seconds ago and that you'll forget a minute from now, short-term memory, and long-term memory, some form of knowledge like the sun rises in the east, that you'll have all the time, you'll likely never forget, and you'll wonder why people even asked you the question of whether the sun rises in the east or west, because everybody shares that knowledge. But the point is, the barest minimum, since 62, the Atkinson-Shiffrin model, I think it's like 62, for, 60 years, is a distinction between forms of cognition that are time-linked, dynamic, a process that changes over time, and long-term storage. However you think, the storage metaphor may not be a good one, but however you think of the representation of knowledge, you tend to have the knowledge tomorrow, the next day, and 2 years later. So the theoretical challenge, therefore, is to develop some kind of model of social cognitive variables that at least is making that cut in nature. And the point of doing it is the one that we've already seen discussed by Professor Scott, that it's not just an intellectual exercise, because in practice, you may wish to have person-focused assessments of social cognitive variables. If theoretically the variables are not well specified, it's unlikely that the assessments are going to make a lot of sense. If you just ask people, what are your goals? Somebody might say, I'm hoping to get lunch in 10 minutes, and somebody else might say, oh, I wish to have children, which aren't, in some sense, the same kind of thing. And to go way back to where we kind of started in the question of what was Albert Bandura doing when not gardening in his backyard, if he is part, with Michelle and others, and there are others, of developing a personality theory, well, clearly the minimum necessary conditions are to have a set of variables that are precise enough, at least another step more precise, to guide conceptions of persons and assessment, and if you can't do that, it's not much of a it's not a sufficient personality theory. So there we go. That's why one of us has been spending so much time, and I'm afraid it's me, on this, which is the knowledge and appraisal personality architecture. So note, the fancy long word at the beginning with the hyphens is self-evident. Anybody would recognize the distinction between knowledge and appraisal. That's the primary study now. Well, it's not a study, a theoretical paper. A couple other words were introduced. We'll come to think of it, it's just one, which was the word architecture. The word, for those of you who are in cognitive science, the notion of architecture here is an explicit borrowing, yes, from the work of John Anderson. So it's the great cognitive psychologist John Anderson characterizes the cognitive psychologist's task of developing a plausible theoretical model of, if you'll allow me, I'll say information processing, even though that's not the best term, of thinking processes. Well, you want to sort of model it. This is a long story, and if I do the long story, they'll ruin the talk, but much of what a scientific theory is a conceptual model. It's like an okay depiction of the thing. So some other room on this campus, well, or at a grade school, may have balls hanging from the ceiling that are the sun and the planets, and then you cheat a little bit, because if the sun is this big, then Pluto is supposed to be 7 blocks away, and so you don't put it 7 blocks away. But even this incorrect, not literally correct model is useful. If anybody has relatives in physics, Niels Bohr's model of the atom depicted something that was like a planetary system with electrons whirring around a sun of protons and neutrons. I'm sure Niels Bohr did not think that the atom looks exactly like that, but it was a pretty good conceptual model. So the notion of if you're building a building and you develop kind of a depiction of the model, it's good enough that the engineer can then build the building. So then personality architecture, it differs from the sort of thing John Anderson does in cognitive psychology, where John Anderson might be interested in the molecular, to me, details of how a person reads letters that are degraded and solves problems by accessing information such that they can do a calculus problem. But if you're in personality psychology, I'm assuming that Allport was correct. What you're trying to do is to understand these consistent, coherent patterns of experience and behavior. So the personality architecture is those mental systems that contribute to that, those patterns of behavior that we call personality. And that's the slight difference, and the word architecture is used because the literatures in personality psychology are completely confused by the use of the word structure, and the word structure had to be abandoned. In Freudian psychology, the structures of mind are the id, ego, and superego. They exist in the person's head. They're within-person variables. In personality trait psychology, the structures are factor analyses of differences between people. Neuroticism and extroversion are individual differences. Unless some cosmic miracle occurs, in general, it's unlikely that the factors that describe the differences between things will correspond to the thing inside the person's head. Why would that be? And this is this is a topic that's been central in the world of psychological measurement now for the past 10 or 15 years, demonstrating that you can have data sets in which the individual difference variables are X, Y, and Z, but individually, literally no one has X or Y or Z as an individual pattern. It just is an emergent property of an analysis of the population. I won't do this, but the psychometricians are Peter Molinar and Denny Boersboom in Amsterdam, and there's a whole world of papers like that in the last, it's been a while now, probably 10 or 15 years. So this talk, why am I introducing the talk after 35 minutes? So this talk is entirely just only, must be some other synonyms, exclusively the conceptual parts without the data and the methods to get the data. And then the second of these talks is, how would you actually do anything, of course that you've already seen from Walt, to collect data and learn something about people? The concept of the Kappa model is that to accomplish what Socrates wanted us to do, at minimum, and no claim is being made that we're done, but at minimum there are three distinctions one needs. I'll do these relatively quickly. To me they seem so straightforward. None of them seem ambiguous. To argue against making the distinction would be, to me, and as odd as arguing against the distinction between the nervous and the skeletal systems. I mean, it's obvious once stated. Some mental phenomena are about things. You can imagine them formulated in words. You're thinking about something. This, we actually, thanks to a question, had this up on screen yesterday, is what philosophers have long called, in an odd terminology in American English, intentionality. It's really quite unfortunate that that's the term, but everybody keeps using it. It's the psychological capacity to think of things, including things in the world that aren't there. So we can think about lunch tomorrow. In the philosopher's example, we can think about the King of France, hypothetically, and form a mental depiction even if the person doesn't exist. Almost all thinking in language is like that. So the proposition, this is a whole philosophy of language topic. What are we doing with language? It's a very hard question to answer why the language has meaning, but whatever is happening in language, there's some set of shared meanings in which the words are referring out to things. So if I refer to furniture, we all know what that means. If we were in a room with no furniture, it's obvious that that's what, but not all mental phenomena are like that. Sometimes you just feel hungry or tired or in a bad mood for no particular reason, or jittery because you had too many, you got a big cup and put the South American coffee in it and inadvertently had 1,000 milligrams of caffeine. And these are feeling states. Feeling states are not about something. The natural language reflects that. If you say, I'm hungry, nobody asks what you're hungry about. I mean, those little demonstrations from the analytic philosophers make things very clear. Oh, I'm hungry about, you're not hungry about anything. It doesn't even make sense. The natural language understands that, I'm thinking of something, what are you thinking about makes sense. I'm hungry, what are you hungry about makes no sense. The natural language picks up the distinction between phenomena that do not have intentionality. This is going to be, though it's not a solution, at least a way of thinking about the fact that if you have an identical twin in Borneo, they might be, as emotionally upbeat and outgoing as you if you ever were to meet them. but not for thinking process reasons, for some inherited feeling states that are separate from social cognitive variables. Without that distinction, which is not made, note, in other variable systems. If you look up the items, for example, on a big 5 scale for any factor, they will mix together feelings, oh, I sometimes feel jittery, with thoughts. Oh, I'm worried that people are looking at me. Those are both neuroticism items, which means neuroticism just blends together feeling states that could be experienced by cats and dogs with social cognitions that could only be experienced by humans, and so fails. One of the 77 reasons that fails as a model of individual persons is it blurs together the most simple, obvious distinction. Secondly is the distinction between knowledge and appraisal. Although I've now made the argument that it's transparently obvious, I'll now attribute the distinction to a particular person. Yes, I wish it was me, but it's not. It's the great emotions theorist Richard Lazarus, who frankly figured out most of the Kappa model, except for one thing, but for some reason, and we don't have to do a history of psychologists who are no longer with us, but Richard Lazarus also was an author of personality textbooks for some reason that worked out very well. He focused on stress, coping, and the emotions in his career, and therefore happened not to take the next 1 or 2 steps that are the Kappa model, but I have no doubt that he would have done this, or certainly could have done the same thing if he had stuck with the study of personality. And since it's on screen, I won't read every word of it, but knowledges are enduring understanding of how things work, a cognitive structure, a personality structure in the language of personality theories, an enduring feature of you that might differ from somebody else, whereas appraisals are used in a specific way by Lazarus to refer to, and he uses the word continuing, meaning that almost any event that goes by, and every appraisal theorist in emotion, I believe, would think the same thing. There's a family of highly overlapping, essentially the same for our purposes, appraisal models of emotion, where an appraisal is an evaluation of the significance of what's happening for one's well-being. Oh, something happened. Oh, it's just a random noise, nothing to worry about. Oh, it's not a random noise, it's some car. Oh, it seems to be heading towards me. Maybe I'll step out of the way. I have plenty of time to step out of the way, so there's no hurry. What I've just done, there's another person. I could save myself by throwing them in front of the car. But that was a norm appraisal. Those are literally the appraisals. Oh, is something happening that's relevant? Is it good or bad? Is it going to change in the future? Can I take action to make it change? Is that action socially acceptable or not, or the standard set of appraisals in any appraisal model of emotion? You don't even need this, but they're like that. The notion in an appraisal model of emotion is that if you're talking to somebody and you're feeling guilty as opposed to sad or anxious or relieved or angry, even though it might not be conscious, you're thinking things to yourself like, oh, I don't think I can handle that. This is bad. Well, I guess this is over. We're done. Too bad. This is good. I didn't like this relationship anyway. So all the emotional experiences are simply coming out of these quick appraisals. And you could even do this cross species. Some species must be making some kind of good, bad appraisals. They must be making some kind of coping ability appraisals. Deer looking at a wide river don't just jump into it. They stop, and they're making some appraisals of what they're capable of doing. And then, of course, humans do that in words and have more complex, socially grounded appraisals. So distinction 2. Seems reasonable to distinguish between knowledge and appraisal processes. Otherwise, it'll be a pretty odd model of social cognitive personality variables. And then the third one is this, which raises the question, what in blazes is this, and why is he talking about it? So I thought I would go back to the avocado slicer and reverse engineer. Why am I talking about this part of the talk, which comes from a branch of philosophy? It's because there may be yet another naturally occurring distinction if you simply reflect on how people think and talk, which is often kind of the same thing, not in general, but and the natural distinction, the clue to what it is, which I've just given away, is the fact that people use language. In other words, I'll say, since this is a conference where it's reasonable to editorialize about social cognitive theory, that for everybody in 20th century social cognitive theory, there probably was, in a sense, an underestimate of the significance of language in the social cognitive variables. Almost all the social cognitive variables, other than affect in the whatever in places the Kappa model stands for. Sorry, I've been giving a lot of talks recently. The cognitive affective part, except for the affect part, everything pretty much involves language, but people don't explicitly say that. Other personality theorists do say that. This is not the time for that, but there are other, I'll mention one, other people whose work is entirely compatible with social cognitive theory, but who very early on say, well, everybody's speaking thinking in terms of language, let's take that as a starting place. This is not the time to review the work and is an obscure reference, but the most prominent person is what country is Hubert Hermans living in? One of those countries they have in Northern Europe, I don't know, Amsterdam or Denmark or what. Hubert Hermans, H-E-R-M-A-N-S, who runs conceptually something called a dialogical model of persons, explicitly imagines that people are running, of course he's right, internal dialogues. Oh, I wonder if I could do this. Oh, my mother encouraged me to do this. Oh, but as Walt mentioned yesterday, if the Pope were here, he wouldn't want me to do this. These are essentially internal dialogues. They're the same things as the social cognitive variables in many cases, except with the recognition that the tool of thinking is socially acquired language, all of which in a sense makes the social cognitive variables even more social because the language tools are, patterns and language games acquired socially. Once you do a bit of thinking about this, which the other people did for me, there's obviously different types of language statements. There are different kinds of speech acts. There's more than these three, but I'll just mention these three. This is a whole area of study called speech act theory and philosophy of language. Yes, it's going to be the same examples Walt used. Oops. I'm in Brazil. My goal is to return to Brazil next year. I think more people should visit Brazil. They're all about Brazil, but there are obviously different kinds of statements. Anybody could classify them as different kinds of statements. The first one is true. The second one, you could apply the concept of true. Had I written this a little better and had I said, I'm going to be in Brazil next year, which is probably what I should have written, then it would be an odd thing to say the statement was true. And it would be an odd thing to say it was false, because I'm going to be in Brazil next year, which would have been the better formulation, is an intentional statement that becomes realized in the future. The first one, I'm in Brazil right now, either fits with the correct thing or not. The second one, had I written, my aim is to return to Brazil next year, or I will be in Brazil next year, is a statement of intention. And some statements, it doesn't make sense to evaluate them as true or false. I liked the dinner. Unless you're blatantly lying, it's not a true-false statement, it's a preference statement. And similarly, I think more people should visit Brazil. It's not exactly a statement that either is true or false, or that has anything to do with my behavior, because even if I had never been in Brazil, I'm referring to here a norm or a standard. Oh, it's good for people to see the world. 200 and more million people live in Brazil. It's interesting politically. More people should visit. It's a statement of goodness. It's an evaluation. The philosopher John Searle introduces a slightly technical, but sometimes technicalities are good, vocabulary for this, and that's referred to as directions or a fit. I'm in Brazil is true or false now, depending upon whether it fits a state of the world. the better phrasing, I will be, I'm planning to, I surely will be in Brazil next year, refers to something that may fit the world in the future, and so it has a different direction of fit, though I didn't quite spell that out, the technical terms, or one has a mind-to-world direction of fit. I am in Brazil now, fits the world or not. The other has a world-to-mind direction. So at some point you might bring about a state of the world next year that makes the statement realized, but right now the world doesn't fit it. Because you're referring to something next year, it's forethought. It's simply a technical way of talking about forethought. And sometimes you're just referring to a criterion of goodness. People should do this. People shouldn't do that. Thou shalt not kill is not a statement that I'm about to kill anybody. It's not really a statement that I'm not about to kill somebody either. That finally a good example for me. It's simply a statement about how things should be. Well, in everyday language, then, belief, goal, and evaluative standard statements unquestionably are different kinds of statements. Since people are unquestionably using language to think about the world, and the language is a form of cognition and the world is the social, it certainly seems like that's another necessary, where's Socrates, I guess he doesn't reappear, carving of nature at its joints, using the distinction that Walt already discussed with us of beliefs, goals, and evaluative standards. Note, not to go crazy criticizing things, but the problem with the Bandura and Michel variables are that they sat in a room by themselves and intuitively came up with a sensible set of variables, as I did in 5 minutes on Saturday morning. But that's not the way to do it. Nobody comes up with variables. So it's possible to ground the variables of a social cognitive theory in a set of distinctions that surely is insufficient for many purposes, but it's hard to imagine that they aren't necessary. Also, it's hard, I don't think it's possible, it's hard to imagine any cultural setting in which people don't have beliefs, formulate thoughts about the future, and think some things are good and some bad. I'm not a cultural anthropologist, but every culture has conceptions of the good and the bad. It's impossible to be a person and not have beliefs and think about the future. The whole world of personality psychology, in a sense, is the formulation of constructs that then fall apart once somebody runs a study in Africa or India or something, where all the people live. It seems inconceivable that these distinctions would not play out, and I'm sure the philosophers already thought of that. So now we have had two distinctions among social cognitive variables. This raises the question, what do we do with those? Well, if both the knowledge and the appraisals have at least some degree, there's a little hand waving here, because one of the appraisals is simply novelty. And it's literally like the amygdala lights up and says, whoa, something happened. That's not linguistic. Putting that aside, that's the hand wave. If the rest of the appraisals have a linguistic structure, I don't think this is going to change by itself, but I'm capable of changing it, and it's okay to change it this way, I won't get arrested, then the intentional states and the knowledge and appraisal distinction cross-cut, and if they cross-cut, we've achieved the great goal, which is to have a variable system never before seen in personality psychology, in which the number of variables is not 5. It's 6, a major step forward. 6, not 5 variables. Yes, only 64 years after the original formulation of the 5-factor model, which was, 40 years after the 3 variables formulation of Freud. So by, 2050, surely there'll be the 7-variable model by somebody else. But moving back to the serious, yes, these things do cross-cut, and they do suggest, as Walt was already embedding in his clinical assessments, which are, of course, moving dramatically ahead of all the clinical assessments everyone else is doing, these distinctions are, I believe, they cut nature at its joints. A series of journal reviewers have thought so too, so it must be true. And that's just a principal set of social cognitive variables. And note, We already had some other distinction between mental phenomena with and without intentionality. Of course, the ones without intentionality, feeling states, hungry, jittery, are not linguistic. There are something else. Non-linguistic, complex mammals experience those, but they don't think, oh, I'm really hungry now. I hope the guy opens the cat food. They're not literally thinking that, but they're, of course, feeling a state of hungry. And that's suggested in some overarching model of the internal workings of mind that contribute to personality, which is to say, a personality architecture. It would have to look kind of something like this, in which there are knowledge structures that feed into appraisal processes. I'll say what the arrows mean. There are affective structures. I am not even going to try, but by affective structures, I mean the sort of limbic system neural structures that, when activated by some contextual feature, that just might be an evolutionary significant feature. If a loud noise goes off, we'll all have the same startle response. That they feed into affective experience. This is not the day for this talk, but unquestionably, I'm not doing this just to look like Bandura's reciprocal determinism. There's no question in a whole world of 40 now years of research on mood and cognition and emotion and cognition, where Professor Scott is also, and I have collaborated. We're not even talking about that. We should give another talk in the late afternoon to just make up more slides. That these go back and forth. If you're in a bad mood and somebody shows you something you've never seen before and asks if you like it, you're less likely to like it than if you were in a good mood, because the residual mood will influence your appraisal processes. If you think of something that was bad, of course, one of the things that will happen is it will trigger emotional experiences. So, of course, these are all interconnected. It's a system. But if you wanted to go about assessing something, it sure seems like you need to keep these distinctions in mind in your assessments. And then you can return to the personality psychology question. People do things. They do things characteristically in ways that differ from what other people do characteristically. Those are what we call dispositions. And then you, the psychologist, can summarize those dispositions, but the dispositions obviously aren't the cause of behavior any more than sickliness is the cause of the person having a virus. It's just the dispositions are summaries. And you can form a variety of types of dispositions. Then, of course, the question, although then the question is what's going on there? How did those knowledge structures influence the appraisal processes? One of the, sorry, it's like beating a dead horse, as they say, but one of the enormous, but at least recognized by the theorists themselves, disadvantages of the personality trait models, like the 5-factor model, is that they say that traits are a structure, and then on the other side of the PowerPoint, it says that something happens, and then there's an arrow, which has essentially the meaning, then a miracle occurs. Like there is no explanation, and everyone knows it, of how the trait structure actually does something, which is why the literature has the bizarre, unscientific terminology. It sounds like a mystery story. The trait manifests itself in behavior, which is a term that appears in hundreds of peer-reviewed. Hope none of the trait theory people are watching any of these videos. Time to tune out now. Nothing to see. But now the question of how social cognitive structures, knowledge structures, are related to appraisal processes, that's easy. That's an entire field of study. People have been studying that for, well, in a sense, since the psychologist Jerome Bruner, who of course died recently, in 1959, who was wildly ahead of his time. If you don't know the work of the great cognitive scientist Jerome Bruner, one of the 3 key founders of cognitive science. But the whole field of social cognition, which it particularly takes off in 1977, coincidentally, provides a whole set of tools for studying this. And bonus, this will allow us to answer the question that we'll see the data for in the second talk, the question of consistency or generalization. and then I'll put up one or two relatively ancient social cognition studies, but the idea, the central part, of course, is here, and it's the thing we already saw in my little illustration of furniture. Well, something occurs out there. There are some situational features. There's a waste paper basket and a bookshelf. I'm thinking about them. I've got some tools at my disposal. The concept of tool is, to me, a useful metaphor. The tools at my disposal are my knowledge structures. Oh, furniture. Yes, sirree, they're furniture. If I've got a concept in my head, furniture, then it kind of immediately comes to mind if I put up a picture of a sofa and a bookshelf and even a waste paper basket. I don't have to ask myself, oh, what category might apply here? They are automatically furniture. The category lights up when the stimulus appears, and once it's lit up, that's how you appraise it. Waste basket, I'm not sure. And, although it goes beyond today's story, well, not entirely beyond, in some cases things might be ambiguous. If, hypothetically, I had shown, why didn't I think of this? I could have made more slides, a series of people playing video games, and then had shown you the person with the MetaQuest headset playing golf, you probably would be less likely to say it's exercise. You would classify it as a video game. If I had shown you a series of people exercising while there's some electronic stuff going on, you know, sensors to pick up how much they're exercising, a video display in which a trainer who's just an artificially intelligent trainer is encouraging you to go on, then the kid playing golf with a headset probably would have looked like exercise because in the standard language I would have primed the category of exercise. And then that comes from recently encountered situations. So if you see something and then something else happens, if you just went to a football game, as you call soccer down here, last night, and then you see somebody who looks athletic, you're more likely to think they might be a football player than if you had not gone to the football game the night before. The game activates the cognitive structures. That's the standard language of cognitive psychology and social cognition. And so in pictures that we probably don't need, in the same way that a sofa and a bookshelf lights up the category of furniture, for some people, if somebody comes out with a bunch of food, it may light up the schema, I'm always eating food, I have no self-control. For that person, it's a me and my low self-control situation. If you're a chef, you're not thinking of that, you're thinking of, oh, what a nice presentation, or you might be thinking it's an overly elaborate presentation for just a simple piece of fish, or whatever. The implication here is that whatever comes to mind, cognitive structure comes to mind, that's what you'll use to evaluate the situation. And then, finally, the significant, it took a while to get here, and I frankly can't recall the exact time when I started, but the large implication, watch, I'll do that, so it's clear it's the large implication, is that if you've got one of these schemas in your head, it may come to mind for you in multiple different situations. When you see a sofa, when you see a chair, when you see a waste paper basket, if those are situations. If that happens, then that is the categorical process that makes these a similar situation for you. If you're really anxious about your physical appearance in social settings, I'll just use the real example, then I'm going to a party and I'm going to a job interview and I've signed up for a class that's a small discussion with 6 people. Those are different situations for most people, but if, for example, you're concerned about your physical appearance or you're concerned about racial stereotypes and you're in a minority group, those 3 situations are an equivalence class. The same kind of thing happens to be in those situations because I'm me, not because that's the limitation of my furniture example. The furniture schema is shared, but schemas like, I don't think people find me attractive, or I have minority status here, and people think this about me. Those aren't shared, and they therefore become a tool to learn about how people differ, explain how they differ across situations, and then you're actually doing what Gordon Allport said you should do. So this then suggests a general case model in which people are carrying around in their head particularly central schemas. If I ask you to describe yourself, what you're like, everybody will be able to do it. Whatever you describe first, you know, if you 15 years ago played volleyball and were good at it, you're not likely to first say volleyball. It's less central. You have other qualities like you're intellectually gifted or you're hardworking or whatever you may be. Those will come to mind first. They'll come to mind first because those are in the language that we'll be using well-developed, highly developed schemas in the language of social cognition. They're knowledge that's highly accessible. This is the language introduced by this Jerome Bruner 60 years ago. They come to mind quickly. The knowledge readily comes to mind with any reasonable stimulus that's relevant to it. It's highly accessible. And then with I find a very handy language, the knowledge often is schematic. It's not a simple fact. I have 3 children. It's a general conception that you use to interpret things or a schema. So that means that in this situation, exams coming up for you, that might be, it's a me and my low self-control situation. And then you're in an argument with somebody, and that might be it's a me and my low self-control situation. The situations are unrelated, dining, exam, interpersonal. Nobody doing trait psychology would put them together in one category, but they may be a category for you. And in fact, then your appraisals might be, I'll never be able to resist dessert after this dinner and I'll gain weight. I'll never get myself to study for this exam. I'll lose my job because I'll never be able to stop arguing with my boss. You might have a low sense of self-efficacy in these superficially entirely different situations because your filter, your lens for viewing the situations is your schema of having low self-control. That, in essence, is the idea. I mean, we're going to keep going with this talk, and then there'll be a break, and we'll come back, and then there'll be the data. But if anyone's computer crashes and you can't see the rest of the videos, that, in essence, is the idea. The schema, once applied to different situations, makes those situations functionally equivalent, and then the rest kind of follows. Well, of course I'll have a low sense of self-efficacy here. Then, now we can move to the rest of the stuff. The standard principle also is that people have multiple schemas. I'm an intelligent person. I have no self-control. Lots of people may think precisely that. That means that it's possible to prime a schema. If somebody just had a conversation with their family saying, oh boy, you're the smartest kid in the family. Finally, somebody intelligent in our family. And then somebody says, oh, exams are coming up. Well, then you might think, things are fine. I'll do great on this exam because you're interpreting the situation in terms of this other schema, your intelligence. This is the sort of thing that's been studied for ages in the field of social cognition. I'm going to do this very quickly. Of course, you can just look up these studies. I won't do the details. It happens that in 1977, which should go down in history as the greatest year in the history of psychology, and I'm not entirely kidding. There are a series of papers that are the most influential papers of the last 50 years that came out at the same time. Obviously, one of them is Bandura's self-efficacy theory. This is the first study on what Torrey Higgins, eventually a Columbia University faculty member, he must have been a graduate student at the time, which is a good trick, runs this following study. This is the prototype study. You in the study read a set of essays that in some sense are ambiguous. A person does a set of actions, and it might be that the actions indicate that they're this kind of person, or the example will make it clear. The actions might be that it's a different kind of person. They might be persistent, or they might be stubborn. They might be self-confident, they might be conceited. In the example, they might be adventurous, or they might be reckless. One is usually good and the other is bad. He pretests these to assure they're ambiguous. This is literally the essay. I've illustrated it. Donald spent a great amount of his time in search of what he called excitement. He climbed Mount McKinley, shot the Colorado Rapids, demolition derby. Demolition derby, this is a sport in the United States where people get into cars and smash into each other. Literally. Piloted a jet-powered boat without knowing very much about boats. Risked injury, death, etc., etc., etc. The way the study is run is this. The person is in that study at, let's say, 1:30. At 1 o'clock, they're in a previous study. The previous study looks like it's a memory experiment. Something happens, in this case it's a visual perception task, in which you look at a bunch of words and you're asked to keep them in memory, and then you're tested on your memory. In the list of words, some of them are personality traits. Obviously, the way this goes is that in one experimental condition, the personality traits are adventurous or synonyms of adventurous. In the other condition, the personality traits are the word reckless or synonyms of the word reckless. Let's skip this. Tori Higgins runs the experiment very well. The prediction on everyday language is that the priming will not cause you in general to think that the individual is good or bad. If you're asked, would this person be a good parent, the manipulation is not supposed to affect anything. The manipulation is priming reckless or adventurous, the constructs, which in the language of Tori Higgins would be applied only in those situations in which it's relevant to appraise recklessness or adventurousness. And that's what happens. So you prime the thing, and the finding, you don't even need the rest. The finding is that if the word adventurous is primed, people like Donald more, they think he's a reasonable person, they think he's sensible. If the word reckless is primed, they don't like Donald, they think he's making a terrible mistake, they think he's less intelligent. The priming activates one versus another interpretation of the situation. That's what the social cognition literature is like. I'll mention one other thing in the social cognition literature, the great, which Walt had mentioned also, the great starter study of self-schema, which of course was published in 1977, like all other great papers. Hazel Marcus, in what must be one of the all-time winners in psychology dissertations, it was her dissertation, proposes that this idea of schemas that goes back to Kant, that was used by a British memory psychologist in the 1930s, Frederick Bartlett, and then became more active as an idea outside of personality and social psychology in the 1970s, that if you added the word self, you would pick up on the fact that people possess beliefs, generalized beliefs about themselves, or self-schemata, of course, from past experience. There's a social foundation of them. As she realized, this is too much text, I'm sorry, it's not from me, it's from her. When they're at the bottom, when a self-description in a personality questionnaire is grounded in a generalization about the self, then it will relate to a consistent pattern of thinking, judgments, and decisions. The concept here is that if you run a study in which you give somebody a survey, you might ask them 20 questions, they'll answer all 20 of them. 16 of them might be completely irrelevant. I don't know, beats me, I don't know. 3 or 4 of them might be central features of their personality. You, not knowing anything, have to take all 20 items, lump them all together, and call them a measure. For 16 of the items, you might be measuring something that doesn't exist. The person never thinks of it. For 3 or 4 of the items, they might be the most central features of their personality, but if you don't know what you're doing because you don't know anything about the person, you just call it, the whole thing, a measure of their personality. And as Marcus realized, that's funny. For certain items, the person immediately answers them. Yes, I'm friendly. For other items, are you reliable at work? You may not be working, you're a student, you never think about this, you think about the question for a while, you give some sort of answer. This introduces an idea. So that's the idea, you have multiple schemas. The concept, this is also in the work of Cantor and Killstrom, who were other social cognitive theorists of the era. There was a bunch of 70s, 80s work. Why it didn't develop into the Kappa model, I do not know. But the ideas of what I said a moment ago, oh yeah, that's me, I guess so, and you answer the question, suggest that reaction time measures, not just the answer a person gives, but the speed with which they give an answer will be indicative of their personality. If somebody asks you a question and you immediately say, yes, intellectual, we learned something about you, and if if they ask you if you're coordinated, I guess I'm coordinated. I didn't actually fall down when walking on a hill in police. Sorry, shouldn't have mentioned that. But I don't normally think of that. It takes me longer to, as a little anecdote, but we'll skip it. The speed with which you answer the questions would be indicative of the schemas. Schemas allow you to quickly interpret things. It did not take you very long to figure out that the sofa was a piece of furniture. It's instantaneous. So what Marcus does is to ask people a bunch of questions. Things flash up on the screen. They have to say as quickly as possible, is that me? Is that like you, or is that not like you? Before the study, the people rate themselves on a series of personality adjectives. The people are called schematic if they have a particularly high or low rating. The concept there is that you usually think about yourself a lot in terms of distinctive qualities. You don't actually think, oh, I'm of average height. Very frequently, if you're of average height, if you're 7 feet tall, you think about height. So she asked people 2 questions. That one, are you high or low on a trait? And is this trait important to you? Is this a significant feature of your personality? She does this for 20 traits, somewhat arbitrarily pulls out this trait of being an independent, like a single-minded independent person. It has a reasonable opposite. If you're very relational, you take care of other people, they take care of you, you're embedded in lots of close relationships, you might not think of yourself as independent, so that's a trait that the 2 ends of the scale aren't really good, bad, which is useful for the study. Some people don't care about independence. They don't say it's important to them. They're called aschematics. That is, they don't have a schema for independence. If you then ask them, are you independent? And they press a button, and you ask them, are you dependent? And they press a button, their reaction times are the same. Independent, dependent, doesn't make any difference to them. It's if I asked you about your opinions about a hockey team in Canada and a cricket team in India, you'd have roughly the same reaction time. You don't think about that. I don't know, I don't care. Whatever it is, there would be no distinction. But if, let's hope I graphed this correctly, sometimes I graph this backwards, if you're in these reaction time tests, you only analyze the items for which the person says yes. Reaction times are always longer for no. So there's a bunch of synonyms of independent and dependent. Sometimes even the person who is dependent will endorse an independent adjective. Sorry, I can't think of examples off the top of my head. If they were sentences rather than adjectives, I might say I'm dependent, but I might say I'm good at studying by myself. When they do that, it takes them longer, as if they're thinking, I guess in this case I'm like that. Similarly, if you're an independent person on a questionnaire, it takes you no time at all to say independent, in the way it would take you no time at all to say good organizational skills or professor, because it's part of your mind, it's a self-schema, and so the reaction times indicate beyond a self-report questionnaire that people have a knowledge structure. In other words, self-schema could be a kind of a game that we're just talking about with no evidential basis. The evidential basis is that you can use some questionnaire assessments, classify people according to having a schema or not, then run a paradigm. Obviously, this is not the only study like this, in which the dependent measure is reaction time and can predict reaction time, and reaction time is precisely the cognitive processing dependent measure that you're expecting will be affected by having a schema, or at least one of those measures. So that's the big background. And now, sorry, oh yes, I haven't done quite the whole thing. but at least I'm roughly on schedule, which is easy to say if you forget when you started the talk. We started with the thing on the left, a kind of abstract model of having a schema and that guiding appraisals. We added this thing on the right for the social cognitive variables, which is the distinctions among beliefs, evaluative standards, and aims, intentions, or goals. If you put that all together, then since that general model, I think this is reasonable too, even though it's not all worked out empirically. That general model probably applies in all cases. In other words, I've mostly talked about having a belief, a self-schema, that affects your interpretation of situations. If let's say I have a goal, highly developed knowledge, my goal is to get into medical school, well, then that also will guide a lot of interpretations. Oh, used chemistry book in a used bookstore, I'll buy that, because it'll help me achieve my goal of getting into medical school. Oh, smart friend who is good at organic chemistry, I'll make better friends with them because that'll help me get into medical school. The situations also can be appraised in terms of a long-term goal, or what's sometimes called like a project in other literatures on goals, that Walt Scott referred to. Thirdly, it's often the case that we have some evaluative standard. You know, we might, let's hope, believe racism is bad, and if we think about that a lot, there may be lots of everyday situations in which something happens at a football game, or somebody is turned down for a job, or somebody is told there's no space in the apartment, that we immediately classify together because we're applying the same evaluative standard, this is bad. So in all three cases, the knowledge structures involving beliefs, personal goals, and evaluative standards may be driving appraisals. So the broadest conception of what the Kappa model is doing is suggesting that the target phenomenon that the field started with, at least in American personality psychology in the 30s, understanding coherent patterns of behavior that distinguish one person from another, that there may be at least three routes to getting there. Of course, they're mixed together, and obviously I cleverly added a few more arrows. But that it's reasonable to imagine three classes of beliefs about the self, driving different patterns of consistency, each of which can be understood in principle on a case-by-case basis. If only you could figure out how to run the assessments and run the studies such that you know enough about the person to make these predictions. So there's a sense in which, I think Walt would say this too, we're all in the middle of that. Like, this is how I will end the second talk. This is not a done, passive thing that happened in the past. I have no tools at my disposal that I'm confident in for measuring standards and even running the study. It's very hard to assess personal standards, because if you ask people if racism is bad, everyone says yes. And so you can't just run a survey because the questions are social, desirable, loaded, and therefore it's hard even to come up with the assessments. I think I know when I started, and it means I'm roughly on time. As this slide says, well, that was it. Theoretically, that was the Kappa model and the most extensive presentation of just the model without data that I've ever done. I'm sorry, because there are people interested in the social cognitive theories, I'll also say I've hardly ever seen like a lecture on the theory, independent of a set of studies, by any of the prior people. I never saw Al Bandura get up and say, here's a 1-hour lecture on social cognitive theory. It immediately turns into, I met Miguel Sabado in Mexico, which is interesting, but, and then the model speaks to 3 other issues. And I'll mention those, then the talk will end, and then we'll eat lots of cakes, and there'll be another talk. One is, what is a disposition? If you want to measure people's personality dispositions, what are you supposed to do? The perspective taken here, I'll do it a little formally and abstractly, is that any measure of a person's tendencies is, as they say, in critical discourse in universities, is a social construction. The psychologist is deciding, oh, I'm going to do this and call this a measure. There are some cases in which measuring a person's overall tendencies might have some practical utility. In other words, I'm introducing a criterion here that's arguing that no single measure is the measure of personality. For those of you who know the Kappa Model, where those profiles are said to be the signature of personality, that might be a mistake, because if the person doesn't care about the behaviors in the profile, the psychologist made them up, then it's not a signature of their personality, it's just what Walter Mischel and Yuichi Shota happened to put in this profile. There are some cases, though, you're running a company, I probably said this earlier, and you might not want to hire the people with the lowest conscientiousness scores. There are many cases in which learning about the if-then profiles is very useful because you identify the situations that are significant for the person. The if-then profiles essentially are like a functional analysis of behavior and behaviorism, with more underlying theory that differs from the behaviorism, but it's the same kind of thing. Or it might be, for some circumstances, that you want to do what, of course, will happen in the second talk and already happened in some of Walt's talk, which is to say that here's an individual person, we're trying to understand that person, we don't know what that person is like. The person walks into Al Bandura's office and says, please assess my personality. We don't know anything, and therefore we have to be entirely person-centered or idiographic, and the huge advantage to that, if you care about individual persons, is that whatever limitations of any particular method, the person's responding defensively or whatever other crazy question a person might ask, you're certainly getting closer to the psychological life of the individual if you run the assessments idiographically. Good. The second topic was explanation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I have, in writing, spent a lot of time on this. Another oddity of trait theory, which always lurks in the background for me, as it did for Walter Mischel, is its style of explanation. Questions of how to explain things are not arbitrary. There is a massive philosophical literature and scientific explanation. It's not a point of debate. I mean, the debate, there are nuances of debate that you can barely understand in a contemporary journal article, but there are lots of what counts as an explanation issue that are clearly worked out and can be illustrated in examples like the one I gave earlier. If you're feeling ill and your doctor says it's due to your sickliness, you know it's time to get another doctor. Right, that's not an explanation. Maybe I'll skip this, but a distinction in that work, and by the philosopher Alison Wiley, is between top-down explanations, in which there's a lawful principle that explains everything, which was the way people used to explain things in the earlier parts of the 20th century. There's a nomothetic law, the thing fits the law, and that's the explanation. You know, sometimes it works. If everything was like physics, there's a law of gravity, it works well enough. And you can say that's the explanation, even if, of course, you haven't the foggiest idea what gravity is. Or, as this Wesley Salmon guy has pointed out for decades, another form of explanation is to identify a system of mechanisms. That system of mechanisms can be assessed separately. You can see how they interact, and they give rise to the phenomenon that you're trying to explain. That bottom-up explanation prevents you from going around in circles and saying sickliness caused the person to be ill and conscientiousness caused the person to be such a conscientious person. We'll skip that. That's the contrast between the trait, and as you'll see it worked out in the second talk, that's the contrast between the trait explanations and the bottom-up social cognitive explanations. It's not one of those straw man things. This top-down explanation is a real thing. Maybe you've been spared this in your background, but the most influential personality trait psychologist of the 20th century, unquestionably, was the British psychologist Hans Eysenck, who's one of the, with Bandura, most highly cited figures of the 20th century. I will add the word unfortunately in some ways. The explanation, a contextualized action tendency, or is what is my term for what Eysenck referred to as a habit. Oh, you tend to make contact with people, or you tend to check if there might be some mistake being made, or you tend to say friendly things to people when you greet them, or you tend to sit by yourself in the back row. Nobody's doing that, so I can use that example. Those are contextualized action tendencies. Those tendencies are explained by Eysenck by going up, a hierarchical model. Well, this thing is an example of this other thing. You're sociable. Sociable is an example of the high-level thing, extroversion. And so if you sit in the back row by yourself, it somehow, through some unexplained miracle, is a manifestation. Eysenck actually had a neural model of this, a manifestation of your extroversion tendency. And of course, the social cognitive model, with all the pictures I've been drawing, suggests that those terms on top are descriptions, and this, of course, is exactly what Bandura and Michel were saying. Bandura simply spent less time saying it because the point was so obvious to him that he just moved on and stopped writing about it. No, those words aren't explanations of anything. You know, they're words like nice weather. That doesn't explain the weather in meteorology. It's just a word, nice. That the explanations are bottom up. Finally, a number of you have been asking, what's going on here in this other part? What are these affective structures? Or if you have an identical twin in Borneo and meet the person tomorrow, yes, they'll seem kind of similar to you emotionally. What's going on there? Tempted to say, I don't know. But yeah, there are people who address this and say reasonable things. In other words, this is not a point of debate. You know, it is not a, somebody told me that Earth is flat. It's a point of debate down here, so I won't use that example. Among some, but there's no question anymore as to whether there's some inherited feature that plays out in emotional tendencies. There's, you know, again, rough 50 years. It's funny, the earliest studies also were in the late 70s. Plomin and those early Plomin studies and those things from Colorado were late, what? There's probably some explanation for the late 70s, which involved maybe the war and then people going to college and then becoming empowered professors who can run novel studies as mature, tenured people who can take risks in what they're doing in the 70s. I don't know. Or maybe there was just energy drinks. But since the late 70s, there's no question that you can run genetic studies. The identical twins are more similar. The identical twins are, in fact, similar even if they don't grow up together. There's no question about it. So how would we possibly talk about that? I will merely say that there already are people who talk about that in ways that are completely consistent with this Kappa model story I just said. In other words, something that's inconsistent is the Eysenck story. The person inherits a social trait, the tendency to do a social behavior, and that produces independently the behavior. That's the wacky, weird story that doesn't work. However, if you're Robert Cloninger, yes, he was right using the same word as me. That's a year earlier, unknown to me at the time. Well, you can imagine sketching an architecture of intra-individual personality systems. Some of those personality systems, which he refers to as character, are social cognitive variables. This Robert Cloninger guy is tremendously good, by the way. Perhaps you would invite him to a conference. Some of those are temperament variables, and Robert Cloninger, being a neuroscientist, can work out structures of the limbic system that play out in basic, you know, the ones that light up. If you're wondering when the talk will end and you're having a picture of a cake that you'll have in 5 minutes, you know, these basic reward systems, for example, that clearly motivate cats, dogs, frogs, and maybe not frogs. No, God, they have to get hungry, frogs. But they don't experience, let's skip the frogs. Sorry, had the same problem with zombies yesterday. Or, from now 5 years ago, this multi-authored paper spearheaded by somebody in New South Wales, Michael Collins. This model of temperament is perfectly reasonable. I'm just going to put up 2 quotes from Collins. Sorry, they didn't format exactly when carried over. Well, this is from Collins. They are studying genetics. They think the big 5-factor model is the dumbest thing they've ever seen. Sorry, I'm stating it straightforwardly. But they're studying genetics. They don't think people inherit conscientiousness any more than you could inherit ability to play football, since over the course of evolution there was no football, so it couldn't have been part of the evolutionary landscape. And they think that the giant problem is the one that I almost haven't even sufficiently articulated, that you don't inherit individual differences. The individual differences variables are differences between people. Individual people inherit a thing. So maybe you should be concerned with, look at that, they're brilliant, with the organization, classification, or description of personality as a within-person model. So there are lots of within-person models. As Walt mentioned, and this is what they draw on reinforcement sensitivity theory, a model of neural systems possessed by a person. So, or there's models of intra-individual cognitive systems like the ones we're talking about here. That's all totally, oops, no, we're not doing that. We're not doing that yet. That moves us to, I think, question 2. To talk to, because it wasn't clear to me how long things would take, so I kind of spilled over the slides. So the answer to that third question about temperament was yes. Hold on, just wait a half hour and then I'll get back to the correct slide. Only 19 more minutes ago. Is that it's perfectly possible, but I can't do it myself, to formulate some conception of temperament so that it refers to a within-person thing that all individuals have. It's much easier to do the neuroscience for temperament. One can easily identify systems that are involved in approach behavior, fears, threats that cause freezing reactions, separate systems in reinforcement sensitivity that cause anxiety. Anxiety is clearly distinct from fear, and that's quite sensible, even though it's together in neuroticism. In the Big Five model, anxiety and fear are different things. Anxiety is when you're approaching something and you're still approaching it and there's a potential threat, as opposed to fear that's just, whatever, giant scary snakes you might have or spiders around here appears and you're just afraid. Those emotion systems are modestly well understood. The different temperament models all say quite overlapping things. The sophisticated people, like Cloninger and Collins et al., completely understand that the target is not to plot Big Five individual differences, it's to understand the psychological organization of character and temperament at the level of a within-person architecture. I can't do that not only because I'm out of time for this talk, but because it requires some knowledge of the neuroscience and then the molecular genetics that causes the variations from person to person in the neural systems. But that's not a mystery anymore. That's a simple everyday problem that's reasonably solved. So you can imagine a more complete version of a Kappa model, which is to say a more complete version of social cognitive theory that doesn't just hand wave past the fact that if you've got an identical twin in Borneo, they will emotionally seem similar to you. So that had virtually no data. Oh, look, I've ended precisely on time. And therefore, I'll stop here, and after the break, we'll pick up the second part, which is how you could study any of this, and of course, we'll try to leave some time for discussion, and you'll see why on my last slide at the end of the second talk. But thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.